We're There we go. So again, Ben Duncan with Kearns and West. We've been brought on to work with you all as a third party and objective facilitation team. And we'll do some introductions. I'll ask Angela, my colleague, who certainly if you all have any tech issues, she can help solve, but will be part of my team, making sure that we're coordinating and capturing what happens in these conversations appropriately. Angela, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Angela Husedius with Kearns and West.
Great, thank you. And so let's start with the DEQ and Oregon Health Department of Environmental Quality and Oregon Health Authority teams. And then we'll ask the ATSAC members to introduce themselves. So Matt, I'll start with you.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. Matt Davis. I'm the Clean Air Oregon Program Manager here at DEQ. Thanks for all the time this afternoon, and it's great to see all the committee members again.
Great, thank you.
Do you want me to?
Oh, pass
Sure.
it, Matt.
All right, go for it, JR.
Hey everybody, my name is JR Giska. I'm the Clean Air Oregon Program Engineer, and I'm happy to be here and listen in. I will pass it to, it looks like we've got Kristen from OHA or from DEQ.
Hi there, I'm Kristen Martin. I'm an air quality modeler here at DEQ. I will pass it to Sue.
Hi, everybody. I'm Sue McMillan. I'm here mainly, I think, because I ran the ATSAC from 2014 to 2017, but it was a different iteration. I'm here to to answer probably historical questions, if there are any.
You want to pass it? We'll go to Holly.
Perfect, thank you. I'm Holly Dixon, and I am a public health toxicologist at Oregon Health Authority, and I will pass it to Dave.
Hi, everyone. I'm David Fair. I'm a toxicologist with Oregon Health Authority also, and know a lot of you from other venues, and glad to see you again and work with you again.
And then it looks like we lost Apple. Matt, do you want to introduce Apple in her stead?
Yeah, maybe. I wonder if Apple got accidentally booted to an attendee or something. But yeah, Apollonia Geckner also goes by Apple, is a program coordinator here at DEQ and is helping to project manage the ATSAC process. So hopefully we'll get her back. Yeah, thanks, Matt. There's in the attendees list, I think there's 13 out of 14 attendees are named Apple right now. So a couple technical glitches, but when she comes back, we'll include her. Did I miss any of our agency partners that are in the room? I think we got everybody. Okay, well, let's introduce the ATSAC members. Let's start with you, Jessica.
Hi, my name is Jessica Myers. I am a senior toxicologist at SRC Inc., which is a private government consulting firm. I did spend about 9 years at the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, which is similar to the DEQ, and I'm happy to be here.
Great, thank you. And then we'll go through our Johns. Let's start with John John Vandenberg.
Hi, I'm John Vandenberg. I'm currently an adjunct professor at Duke University in the Nicholas School of Environment, and I have about 35 years of experience as a risk assessor for air toxics and the criteria pollutants with the Environmental Protection Agency. I retired about 2 years ago, but I'm still semi-retired is what I'd say. Thank you.
Semi-retired. Now, John B, I'll have to enunciate better. John, please.
Okay, formerly John Boudreau, formerly with California Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment. Retired the end of last year, so I am just assisting on this. And in my prior life, I used to run the air toxics hotspots program, which, you know, the Oregon program is kind of loosely modeled on. So,
Great, thank you. How about John S?
Hi, I'm John Stanek. I'm a senior toxicologist with the Center for Public Health and Environmental Assessment at the EPA, located in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina.
Thank you, John. Daisy?
Hey, my name is Daisy Dong. I'm a staff toxicologist at the Department of Pesticide Regulation at the EPA. So I've been here for like more than 6 years. work on the pesticide and some fumigants.
Thank you, Daisy. Susan?
Hi, I'm Susan Tilton. I'm an associate professor at Oregon State University.
Great, thank you. And then have we gotten Apple back, or let's see?
No, I think if it's, and Jefferson Fowles also needs a link, Angela, and I'm wondering if it's possible to generate, and I can share his email address in the direct chat with you, Angela. I wonder if it's possible to generate new panelist links for the two of them and maybe name Apple's slightly different so it's gets out of the trap that it's falling into now. So thank you.
Okay, and just before you do that, Angela, if you want to just open up the slides, then I'll walk through the agenda so we can kind of move through our discussion. And I'll walk through the agenda while you figure out how to get people in the room. Well, this growing pains, folks. So my appreciation for Angela is going to be doing a little bit of juggling as we move through. So I'll walk through the agenda. So we've kind of done welcome and introductions. We'll have a conversation really building off not just our last discussion, but the conversations that I had with each of you that informed the finalizing of the charter, group agreements, operating principles that we'll be utilizing through this. And I'll recognize just now, as an advisory body, we're not creating kind of a formal structure for voting, but we do want to approve the charter today and just make sure that folks feel good moving forward. So I'll probably just ask for some thumbs up or head nods that we're good with that. And then we're going to move into a variety of conversations that really is kind of the first time that DEQ and OHA will be kind of seeking your input on a series of questions related to authoritative sources, to a discussion on the PRV or toxicity reference values process, and definitions around chronic and acute PRVs. We'll talk about the workflow and how the conversations will move towards ultimately what DEQ will be learning from you all. And then open just space for questions and comments. And you'll see as we go through this today that there'll be natural pauses where we'll be seeking very specific and intentional dialogue and discussion with you all. And if everything goes well, which I promise that it will, we will walk out at 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, if not a few minutes early. Any questions about what we're hoping to achieve today? Okay, I'm going to take a momentary pause. There's Apple, the official Apple. So Apple, Matt did introduce on your behalf, but you want to say hi to everybody?
Hi, everyone. I'm Apple. I am the program coordinator for Cleaner Air Oregon. Thanks for being here.
Of course. So we just walked through the agenda. Jefferson, can you say hi? Introduce yourself.
Yes, hi. Sorry to be late. Jefferson Fowles, principal toxicologist for New Zealand Food Safety currently, but formerly with the California Department of Public Health.
Awesome, thank you. And in New Zealand, which is not exactly Pacific Standard Time. So thank you for being flexible and being here. And I think with that, unless Matt or others at DQ or OHA, if you have anything else to offer, I'll pass it to Holly to start moving us into the agenda. Okay, Holly, floor is yours.
Awesome.
Actually, no, it's not yours yet. Let's go next.
Yeah, I'm gonna pass it back.
Yeah, there's growing pains, folks, growing pains here. So I want to thank you all. We had the time to speak with you and really provide some input into the charter, into the operating principles, and hopefully, in preparation for this meeting, you had a chance to review the charter with some updated language that took a couple of forms. So one, we did add, it's not on this slide, but we did add a process step for deliberation. I think every one of you in our conversation said it was an important part of not just kind of going around the room and hearing what people thought, but also taking the time to give some space for folks to discuss, debate, dialogue, deliberate. So we have included that as part of our kind of process that we'll use, and we'll model that today. And then we did also make a change around ground rules that really shifted this discussion from health science to really focusing our conversation on health risk assessment. So those were the kind of major changes. Like, I don't know if they're major changes. Those were the changes that we made in updating to the charter. So I want to pause for any questions or comments. And again, as I said earlier, because we're not a decision-making body, so we didn't build in any formal mechanisms for kind of voting. But I will ask, one, for questions and comments, and then just ask for general agreement and comfort moving forward with the charter as described and sent to you all. Any comments or questions, though, before I ask for folks' comfort with moving the charter forward? Okay, not hearing any. Can I get either a thumbs up or a head shake or a hand raised for agreement that folks are comfortable? John, I saw you come off mute.
I just had that in my little bio sketch, there's a couple of typos there that I can share separately.
Okay, thank you, John. We'll with that as a amendment. John Boudreau, I assume that's an approval hand raised. Thank you. Thank you, Susan, John. Thank you, Jefferson. Good. Okay. All right. Well, I will see those hands raised as an approval and comfort moving forward with the charter. So thank you all. You collectively made your first contribution to decision making. So now, now I'm passing it to you, Holly.
Maybe Matt will go first, and then I'll go. Oh, I can't hear you.
Well, looks like Holly maybe man, I think the internet's tired after a whole week Friday afternoon. So I think we lost Matt. Holly, do you want to dive in, or
Yeah, I can, I might have some notes of Matt's and he can fill in. I know there was a few main points he wanted to make on this slide, and I'm not exactly sure what they all were, but I think this is a slide that I will walk through later in the presentation. So don't worry about all the different phrasings on here. I'll walk through all of it later, but it kind of just sets up all the different topics that we're going to talk about later today. And one thing that I think Matt wanted to talk about here was just kind of the definitions of these different lists that we're going to be talking about. And this was in that orientation meeting that we talked about last time. But the first being this priority list and what that is. And it's a list of over 600 chemicals that are reportable in our Cleaner Air Oregon program. And all permitted facilities need to report on these emissions as part of a statewide emissions inventory exercise that happens every 3 years. And these facilities are undergoing this risk assessment must report emissions if they're on this list. So this is a list that DEQ is managing and will be updating based off of what they know about emissions in our state. So we're not really going to be bringing updates to that to you all, but just for you to be aware that this is a list that will be looking for TRVs that apply to chemicals on this priority list.
so
So
Holly,
then there's a second, yeah.
real quick, Matt is back in the room, but
Okay, he's back.
let's see if we can hear you, Matt.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. So
Okay.
Matt's back.
you want
Okay.
your piece, and then we'll
Sure.
Holly.
So Matt, I was going over just like those definitions again, what that priority list is. And so
Right.
maybe you can take it from there, and kind of now that we have those definitions of those lists that we covered in the last meeting, kind of setting those expectations that you want to talk about, like what are the bodies of work and what are the kind of expectations for this group.
Super. Yeah, sorry about that. I've never had a microphone error before. It's just the meeting is full of surprises, isn't it? Yeah, so I think as Holly was alluding to, we're really conceptualizing kind of this as two bodies of work. One is to review the list of chemicals for which Oregon has recognized TRVs to see if any of our authoritative sources have updated the values that, that we rely upon for our program. And the second body of work is to review that priority list, chemicals that are reportable, but for which we don't have TRVs for, to see if since we adopted those TRVs, any of the authoritative sources have now adopted values that we should consider adding to the program. And you know, as we talked about in the last meeting, we'll talk more about today. We, the agencies, you know, have what we call authoritative sources listed in Oregon law and administrative rule that we are directed to rely upon. And one of those sources, the final one, is the agency DEQ in consultation with this group. So, you know, I think as a matter of kind of rule and just practicality, we have to rely on some of these other sources as our primary bodies of evidence. We don't have, you know, everyone involved in reviewing these toxicity reference values for our state is on this webinar. We don't have other staff or a program or a team full of people who are going to be able to do this work. And really don't have the capacity to do a deep dive on a chemical by chemical basis. And so the way we are approaching this, and that you saw in the issue brief, was to try to land on a hierarchy or algorithm that we will use across the list to evaluate any changes that authoritative sources have made, and to prioritize which ones we want to propose for adoption or to update our values. And in some instances, we know that none of our authoritative sources have values or have made updates. And that is where we expect this committee to go deeper on a chemical basis. And we'll talk more about that in a bit. And I think we've signaled already that we expect that we know of at least two chemicals that we know we'll be bringing to you. One is diesel particulate matter and the other is manganese. And I think the other, you know, constraint that I wanted to just talk about with this group so you understand our rationale is in Oregon, every single toxicity reference value is detailed in rule. And our agency doesn't have authority to change rules. We have to work with an independent rulemaking commission, and that process in and of itself takes about a year, which will happen subsequent to our work with you as ATSAC. And when our program was designed, our commission envisioned us doing this exercise every 3 years, which I'm not sure is frankly achievable, and we're going to be talking about that too. But you know, this again, just, you know, I think what I'm trying to point out to you is we have a whole process that we are just beginning in order to update a single value, and that again, paired with our resource constraints, is why we are proposing and really will need to use an approach that relies on these authoritative sources and not doing a really deep dive on every single value or every single chemical. So today's meeting, as Holly's going to talk about, is really focused on a couple key process questions before we start talking about particular chemicals. One is, when we, as the agency, are the authoritative source in consultation with ATSAC, how do we want to do that work? What types of information should the agencies consider when we're looking at other sources of information beyond ATSDR, EPA, and Cal EPA? And the other really key questions are to discuss this proposal that we've put forward in the issue brief about how we want to treat reviewing values from multiple authoritative sources. How do we want to pick one to move forward with in our process to update Oregon's values? So hopefully that's helpful context and just kind of teeing up for today's meeting. And we're going to have a chance to go, you know, much deeper on these issues over the course of the next couple hours. So I think I'll kick it over to Holly. Sorry again for the technical difficulty there.
Well, before Holly, you go, John, you want to jump in? Question?
Just a question. This is very clear. Thank you very much. But the list itself, do we have a role in identifying or suggesting other chemicals that might be considered as priority contaminants? And the reason I ask is that I'm on the North Carolina Science Advisory Board, and we've been struggling mightily with not just PFAS and PFOA, which are on the list, but the many, many other related compounds, of which there are a lot. So I don't know if that's a role that we have here or in any fashion. Can you comment on that?
Matt?
Yeah, and I'll invite Holly and others too. This is something we've also been wrestling with, John. So the chemicals on the priority list are also in rule and also require a rulemaking. And then, you know, one thing we've gotten ourselves into a little bit of a chicken and egg situation is, you know, are there chemicals that we might want to add to the priority list that have TRVs from the authoritative sources and therefore add to both lists? And that exercise of doing that investigation in and of itself is a huge lift. So I think right now is what I'd say is that it's possibly a role for ATSAC, but we have some more work internally to do to decide the extent to which we are going to take on adding additional chemicals to the priority list in the first place, I guess. So.
Okay, thank you.
Any other additions from agency? Okay.
Oh, that sounds great. I'll just add throughout this whole time today too, it just, if you have any suggestions for us to look at as we go off and do the work, or any resources or chemicals that are coming to mind that you want us to pay special attention to, like definitely by all means, I'd really appreciate that if you want to reach out and send us stuff.
Yeah, thank you, Holly. And just before, Holly, you go, just I want to just do a little bit of a process description. So what we'll be doing is, you know, you'll hear some content description, and then we've really intentionally built in space for very targeted questions for you all. And the plan is really to kind of get feedback from each person around this table, and then create a little bit of space if necessary for folks to go a level deeper. And so as we go through this, you'll see slides of content, you'll see slides with directed questions for you all to respond to. We'll create some space for that and then move to the next piece. So just from a process perspective, that's what hopefully folks will be prepared to engage with. All right, Holly, floor is yours.
Thank you. Perfect. So this is my first slide, and I have a series of slides. I don't have that many though, but I wanted to point out that everything I'm pretty much covering on my slides is in that handout that we gave you all that you should have, and it's on our website as well. But it's this proposed TRV update and selection process for ATSAC review handout. And within there is a bunch of different links to the rules and all of that. So those should all be hyperlinked in there, and I'll kind of be talking off this handout for the majority of today's meeting. And then I'll stop every couple of slides to go over some of those discussion questions that we had at the end of the handout. So those will all be from there as well. So I wanted to start off with kind of reviewing this list of sources of toxicity information that DEQ considers to be authoritative in terms of scientific rigor and those comprehensive methods for producing toxicity information. And so we call these authoritative sources, and they're all listed on this slide, and we showed these to you all in that orientation meeting as well. But this is ATSDR, EPA, Cal EPA, and Oregon DEQ in consultation with you all. And so these sources are in Oregon administrative rules, which were adopted by DEQ's governing board, which is the Environmental Quality Commission, that we also call EQC. And so recently in 2021, Oregon DEQ in consultation with ATSAC was added as an authoritative source by the Environmental Quality Commission. And this really just gives us more flexibility in this TRV update process. So that does mean that DEQ in consultation with ATSAC can develop TRVs and consider TRVs developed by organizations kind of outside of EPA, ATSDR, and Cal EPA. But as Matt just mentioned, we do primarily rely on these three authoritative sources for TRVs, and for several reasons that we outlined in that handout we gave you. Briefly, I'll mention one of them is that the agencies included on this slide go through these extensive peer-reviewed processes to establish TRVs using the best available science and research. And for each chemical, there's expert panels that spend years reviewing hundreds of scientific studies that really look at the whole weight of scientific evidence here. And this requires substantial investment of tax dollars. In addition, regularly establishing new TRVs is beyond the capacity of agencies in Oregon. So for us to do this, it would be a rigorous and costly process. And in many instances, we think that the state level review would likely confirm the conclusions of these other authoritative sources. We can go to the next slide. So since developing a TRV is very resource intensive, we're thinking we'd only plan to look for TRVs beyond US EPA, ATSDR, and Cal EPA if the criteria on this slide are met. So these criteria would be none of our authoritative sources have a value already. We think there could be a high likelihood of harming public health in Oregon from this chemical exposure. There's adequate scientific information available, and there's staff bandwidth within this rulemaking process. And so due to resources, our first preference here would be to look at TRVs from another state or country. And we could modify these values if necessary. That's something we could definitely consider. But in these cases where we look at TRVs developed by an organization that's not on our authoritative list, we're thinking we definitely want to look at that organization's selection of points of departure and their application of uncertainty factors, just to make sure that those are congruent with the approach taken by these other three main authoritative sources that we already have in rule. If it's not completely congruent with that approach, we could still use portions of that agency's work, but we could make some modifications as well to point of departure selection and those uncertainty factors to make it more consistent. And this is the type of work we're expecting. If we're proposing to do any of that, we'd be consulting with you all for that type of assessment and application. So I'm going to pause there for discussion on authoritative sources, and maybe we could pull up the discussion questions as we open it up on the next slide.
Yeah, Jessica,
So real quickly,
or
yeah.
just, do you want to walk through the question, and then Jessica, I see you have your hand up. Do you want to, is it for clarity, or are you responding to the question?
It was from before. I just had but I can wait until we do the discussion if you'd like.
Yeah, well, Holly, will you kind of describe the question that's being asked, and then Jessica will come to you first, and then open it up and go around the room?
Sure, that sounds good. So this is the first one, just covering the authoritative sources kind of before we get into the acute and chronic discussions. The question is, what should DEQ and OHA consider when reviewing values from other organizations or agencies that are not listed as an authoritative source? And feel free to chime in on anything else that has come up for you so far in this discussion.
Well, and maybe just to add, Holly, I think that the question really is focused on kind of the organization and agency as opposed to a specific chemical. To your question earlier, John, I think that we can have that conversation as well, but I think this question is really focused on, are there other authoritative sources that we should bring in? So let's start, Jessica, let's come to you. And then if it's okay, what I'll do is maybe start with any clarifying questions. And then I'm just going to ask each of you to provide any feedback, making sure each person has a chance to contribute, and then we'll open it up to a broader conversation. But Jessica, let's start with you.
Yeah, so I had a question about the authoritative sources. So I understand we have those three sources, but the methods used by those sources can vary quite significantly. So how are you planning to handle the fact that the values may be orders of magnitude different between those three sources?
Who's answering that? Was that you, Holly?
Yeah, I can take a first response, but it might be helpful too of when we get into the acute and chronic, we can kind of split them up and maybe talk about them in terms of how we're going to be picking from those authoritative sources. There are differences, but there are a lot of similarities as well. And so we have been, like, when we get to the chronic slide, we're talking about maybe taking one that was published more recently, but it is an assumption of of comparing the quality between all of those existing ones that we already have in rule. So I think maybe we'll get more to that discussion.
That get to where you're going, Jessica? I mean, I think it seemed like it's a methodology question that you're asking, but do you want to add any more to the context of what your question is?
Well, I mean, I think that it's also going to impact how you choose the non-authoritative sources. So if you're going to choose one of those sources that, for example, uses a certain uncertainty factor or does a duration adjustment, then that would also apply to the unauthoritative sources. So I think it's something that's important to consider up front.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
So, thank you, Jessica. So if it's okay, why don't we work around the room? And if you don't have any considerations, then you certainly feel free to pass, but we'll kind of go in order that we did earlier. So let's start with Jessica. Do you have a response to this question itself in terms of other organizations or agencies that are not listed that you feel like should be considered as part of this conversation?
Well, of course, I'm a little biased. I think TCQ with the state of Texas has some great values. In fact, they actually have they have values for manganese. So if you want to look for those, you can find them there. But there are other states also that develop their own values. Michigan and New York have some. So, I mean, I think it's important to classify state agencies above other non-governmental sources that may have bias in developing their values. But again, I think you should look at the sources that are using the methods that you want to derive these values, because some of the methods, even between EPA and Cal EPA, can be very different. So I think that's important.
Great, thank you, Jessica. So just really, and I think you made a point, right? Considering, right, that the work of states versus the work of non-governmental agencies. And I think we would have been disappointed if you didn't reference Texas. I think that was good for you in that work. John Vandenberg.
Thanks. I'm glad that Jessica raised the question there, because I know I think it's an important one. Can you hear me? Let me say.
Yeah, we got you.
Okay. Some of the considerations I think include whether the other organization or agency has published their methodology for their assessments. I think you need to have that reference so that you can see how they did it, make sure that there's consistency with what the other values that come from ATSDR, EPA, and Cal EPA are. Part of that, another part is I think that having a public comment is an essential part of that as well. And I think really I would focus as a third point on other agencies as authoritative, not necessarily other organizations that might be NGOs, just because I'm not sure that we have quite as good an understanding as to how those were developed and what the motivation was behind that. The last point I guess I would make is that newer doesn't necessarily mean better. And so I would consider it, if there's competing values, that the state look at why there are different values for different organizations and try to understand that difference and whether the differences for one organization or another is consistent with the Oregon approach. I guess I think that's probably my points at this point. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, John. I know we'll be coming back to the kind of time horizon in terms of most recent later on in this discussion. John Boudreau.
Yeah, I think echo some of what John Vandenberg said. Things like availability of the methodology and specific derivation that's used for that chemical. Public comment and peer review. I mean, everything should be considerably transparent. And the other thing is the health value should be based on actual adverse health effects. I know there's some health values that TCEQs put out that are based on odor perception, for example. And there are times where that has been used by other agencies, but if it's used across the board, you have to that can be an interesting point of discussion. So.
Yeah, thanks, John. And going back to our earlier conversation, right, that focus on health risk assessment is certainly part of our commitment here. Jefferson, I see your hand.
Yeah, thanks. I further support what both of the Johns just mentioned. I think that it's also important to ensure that whatever values or other agencies values are adopted, that they are de novo derived values that have been authoritative, through their own authoritative process, adopted from some other source, because that can be a messy situation if we're then, if they're accepting PLDs or something, or some as the basis for their values or something like that. It has to be really a de novo derived based on primary data, I think, and then having the peer review and public comment methodologies is essential. So.
Okay, thank you, Jefferson. Susan, can we go to you?
I would just echo what others have said about considering and understanding the methodology for the other values when considering them, and allowing input on those after the fact through a public comment period.
Thank you, Susan. Daisy?
So actually, I kind of like Jessica, ask this question. So I'm thinking, maybe DQ should come up with some kind of basic guidance, because of all these agencies may use same study, but because we all have a different, guidance, like a DPR, like at my institute, even we think EPA, DPR actually use very different criteria with OIHA. So OIHA is more conservative. They add a lot of like uncertainty fact, but DPR, is in a sense, we based on science. So I think maybe, to me, for this question, I think a DQ or OHA may need to set up some kind of criteria. So you like more conservative or more scientific based. So it's when you look all this back, it could come down, just like a set up the uncertainty fact. But this, different agency has different guidance. So I think maybe either this committee help the DQ, OHA, and set up some kind of guidance. Because I think public comments, of course, that's a good source too. But for Oregon to set up their own, you need some kind of your own criteria. You want just completely based on the conservative, whatever value is lowest, that's also your guidance. Another thing is, even within EPA, there's some very recent science may not be incorporated into the different agency, even within EPA, because I did the sulfuric fluoride, and I know with like the port of entry effect. For the port of entry effect, actually the human equivalent concentration, the adjustment factor is 1 based on the most recent science. But, even within EPA, for the pesticide, branch, they don't use this. So that's why all come down to like what kind of criteria you want to use. So I think this is kind of important, because that's what basically decides what value you choose. So that's what I have.
Yeah, that might be something we come back to in terms of kind of that conversation of criteria and guidance. So the agency, maybe there's a response there. Can we go to John Stanek?
Yeah, hi. Yeah, I can continue in a similar vein. About, I don't know, 6 to 8 years ago, we came into the same issues with looking at the availability of reference values for hydraulic fracturing. And we came up with a similar approach as far as criteria and databases of search. But we do have so in that report, we have a pretty extensive appendix that does go through some of the other sources that might be available. Granted, though, this was geared towards oral reference values, so I'm not quite sure which databases might also have inhalation reference values available. But it also kind of goes through some of the ones we considered and maybe why we did it, but you know, they are potential alternative sources might be listed there for when you can't find things. One of the ones we considered off the top of my head was maybe WHO, I think, has a few databases for some reference values, but if I can find the link, that's something I could share in the chat that, you know, you may want to consider going forward just as a resource to see, you know, an approach that we used for, you know, well over 1,000 chemicals.
Yeah, thanks, John. And that's a good example as folks make references or have resources that you feel would be important for DEQ and OHA to consider. So that reference of an appendix that might have some resource for things that maybe you can't find an existing value for, that'll be really helpful. And sharing those links is a really important part of this process. So I think we've hit all the members. Is there any other, I mean, have you heard your colleagues? Is there anything else coming up, or for our agency partners, is there anything you're hearing that you want to reflect back? John Vandenberg.
No, I think that's, I think we've kind of covered it. I think another point that Jessica made is that some of the agencies will be quite different in the values. And I think it's a policy choice for the state whether to choose one that may be of a lower value, which would be more health protective in the face of uncertainty about what value to use. But that's a real policy, not a science choice.
Yeah, thanks, John. And certainly, right, we've talked about it at the orientation meeting, kind of the distinction between kind of this focus on kind of science and health risk assessment versus the policy choices that you referenced. Any other thoughts or comments or any response from our agency partners? Yeah, Matt, please.
Yeah, I think just a little reflection on that last point. I agree. That particular, I mean, we're going to be talking more about that throughout this meeting, and I agree it's very close to, or it is a blurred line between, you know, it's the application of science, right? And acknowledge that, and also acknowledge that that's okay to talk about here, that type of issue, and you're not a decision-making body, and that there will be other points in the process to more kind of debate the other effects of policy decisions, I guess. So yeah, I just want to acknowledge that, John, and I agree, and we're going to talk about some of that today, and don't feel like you can't or shy away from just acknowledging that or engaging in that discussion. So.
Yeah,
Matt, just a quick response. Thanks. I think I should have said it's a science policy choice because it is at that junction between science and policy, and that's where the methods that are being used oftentimes will delineate the science policy choices that have been made in an assessment process. You know, there's many choices that could be made along the way. So it's there are science policy choices, but again, as I understand it, Oregon doesn't have a set guideline for risk assessment per se, whereas other agencies do, and they're delineating in those documents, guidelines, what those science policy decisions are in many cases, not all cases. This is actually, I guess where I'm getting at is the end decision is informed by those science policy choices along the way. So it's not a simple matter, but I think I'm glad to hear that it's something that we should also kind of comment on appropriately as we go through.
Yeah, thanks, John. And Daisy, I think that's part of what you were also putting forward in terms of criteria and guidance from the agency. Any last thoughts before we keep moving to the next part of the discussion? All right, Holly.
Great, thank you, and thanks for the discussion. Is helpful, and I think we can dig into it a little bit deeper too in this next section of like 2 or 3 slides, so we can really talk about chronic. We'll go there next, and we can talk maybe about that criteria and the more recent values. Talk about that a little bit more. So for selecting TRVs, so as a quick reminder, it's in the handout, DEQ is using the term TRV when we're just talking about health-based toxicity values. And there are definitions of those TRVs in the handout we provided for both acute and chronic, and those are definitions that are in the rule in Oregon. But as a brief reminder, in terms of length of exposure for Oregon, we're talking about for acute exposure to a toxic air contaminant evaluated over a 24-hour time period, and chronic here means exposure to an air contaminant over a 1-year period for non-carcinogens and a lifetime of exposure for carcinogens. And DEQ has used and proposes to use different processes for selecting chronic and acute TRVs, and really want to hear from you all on that today. So this next slide has the table. I can go to that one. There we go. So this slide has is from the handout that we gave you all. And this includes the authoritative sources and the chronic TRV names. I also want to point out that within the EPA, we're looking at values from the Integrated Risk Information System called IRIS and the Provisional Peer-Reviewed Toxicity Values called PPRTV. A question for you all today as well is also, are there other places within the EPA we should be looking for values? And then within Cal EPA, we've been looking at values from the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment. Again, want to hear from you all if there's other values. And the authoritative sources here all assume the same exposure time when developing their chronic TRVs. And it's important, I think, to point out here that the process to select a TRV when more than one TRV is available is not in rule. So in the past, agencies have chose to select the most recently published TRV from among the authoritative sources. So for example, the agencies would select a TRV developed in 2018 compared to the one in 2010. And this is something that we just kind of briefly brought up, and I hope we can talk about more here. But DEQ and OHA right now are proposing to use the same selection approach, but want to hear from you all on this. And really, we want to just kind of ensure that we're basing it on the most recent view of scientific studies that are done by an authoritative source. So again, it'd be great if we could talk about this in more detail. So maybe we should go to the discussion question and then open it up, and like to hear from you all your thoughts when comparing these authoritative sources we have listed.
Yeah, great.
So yeah, go ahead.
Well, Jessica, I see your hand, and then we'll do the same kind of operation. I'm going to mix it up a little bit so we hear from people in different orders. But Jessica, start us off.
So I was just going to say, if you go back to the last slide, we could kind of go down the line. But as far as ATSDR, they actually have an intermediate value also, which means that they do not typically use subchronic studies to develop chronic numbers, because they would use subchronic studies to develop their intermediate numbers. But EPA consistently uses subchronic studies. So the durations of these are going to be slightly different depending on the data available and the value that we're talking about.
Yeah, thank you, Jessica. Let's go kind of, we'll bounce around a little bit. Let's go, John Stanek. If you want to go to the discussion questions, really around the kind of most recent, and I think John Vandenberg, you had brought that up earlier, I believe, but John Stanek, do you want to offer some feedback on the discussion question?
No, I don't think I really have anything on this right now.
Okay, thank you. Susan?
I did have a follow-up question, just as to whether or not when these values are being compared and there's recognition that there's a difference in a most recent value. I mean, are you aware of what is contributing to that difference? Is it that there's just new data available? Is the methodology changed?
Yeah, David, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, and there was another thought I had that I think answers the question and and also poses another one back to the group. So Jessica, in your answer to the last question, mentioned that there is differences even within an agency about how the approach that they take to create a number. And the biggest one of those that I've noticed, when we're looking we've been looking at a lot of these numbers from a lot of agencies at the same time, like in a kind of comprehensive process. And the biggest predictor seems to be time, like the error, like an EPA reference concentration developed in 1991 used probably a pretty different method than EPA IRIS would use in 2023. Across all of those agencies, for like a really good example is benchmark dose modeling, right? Like in the 90s, like everyone was just using no L's or low L's as points of departure. And then over time, across all agencies, there was a clear preference to move towards benchmark dose modeling wherever possible. So nowadays, that's like the first choice, like all the agencies' first choice is to use benchmark dose if they can. So to me, that was an argument for using the most recently published study, hoping that the more recent methods are more, at any given point in time, there's more similarities than differences among the ways that the agencies do this. It's just that the pace of keeping up with the reviews of chemicals is different among agencies. So if no one's reviewed it since 1991, then maybe all you have is a really old value from one agency using the methods of that time. Now I can't remember if that answered Susan's question, but I did raise the question. But that does set up for the question back to the group. Like does that idea trigger anything for you about the way that we would select from among multiple authoritative sources for the same chemical?
Yeah, that's helpful, David. So really just looking at kind of the modernization of methodology, if you will. Susan, I did want to just make sure you get some clarity on the question you asked, and if any other thoughts, and then Jefferson will come to you. Susan?
No, that did, David, thank you.
Any other thoughts on the question itself?
No, I think based on what David said, I mean, if it's really focused on improvements in the methodology, I mean, then there's a good rationale for focusing on most recently published data. But emphasis on just understanding, why there are differences, and as opposed to automatically using the most recent data.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. I think that's kind of the crux of like what would persuade towards most recent, what would persuade or give hesitation to not the most recent. Let's go Jefferson and then John Boudreau.
Yeah, thanks. I think that it would maybe help the discussion when these sort of things start to come across our plates, if we could keep in front of us whether the change or the difference is due to the key study versus the endpoint selected, or some component within the key study which affects the point of departure, versus the dose response modeling, usually the benchmark dose that was just mentioned, or alternatively, if it's simply an uncertainty factor difference which has been applied differently by a different organization, either it's 3 or 10 or something like that, for the same area of uncertainty. So I mean, it would be nice if there was some sort of categorical way to just quickly sort of triage the differences so that we sort of know, because if it's a new study, then to me that's that's really raises the need to dig a little more into the weeds and to really look at what's been done, versus if it's just a methodological difference which is known to be different across different agencies, and that's a quicker assessment.
Yeah, thanks, Jefferson. I appreciate the frame of triage differences, and I think that's work that would need to happen. So, John Boudreau.
Okay, first off, just to clarify, when you say recently published chronic TRV, would that cancer also be included in that?
Yes.
Thumbs up from David, yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
then recent examples I'm familiar with would be ethylene oxide as an example. And both EPA and TCEQ have very recent evaluations based on the same general data set with dramatically different opinions on how that data should be modeled, resulting in a three order of magnitude swing between the cancer potencies. So, and TCEQ might be newer. I'm trying to remember the exact timeline on those, but that's one where you would certainly have to go into the both evaluations to really figure out which way you wanted to go with that. And that goes strictly on this one is more recent, therefore we'll go with that. So there's going to be some cases where, you know, you're going to have to go into the weeds with it, like it or not. You know, just looking at the data publications isn't going to do it.
Yeah, thank you, John. Let's go, Daisy.
So I think all other, member already talk about the issues, but I just want to clarify. So when you guys present us the TRV, are you going to list all the TRVs you found from different sources, or just, list the one you think is the most recent one? To me, I think I actually agree with some of the members talking about, it's a matter of what study, what endpoint you use, what methodology, now like all the modern BMD modeling, eventually I think, if we have more than one TRVs, it all come down to what criteria we need to use. There's because of why different agencies use different, guidelines, because they also, all scientifically justified. So eventually all come down to what Oregon want to use. And before the couple of slides before, and I think Holly asked what agency within CAR EPA. So actually you can look at our DPR value, Department of Pesticide Regulation. If there's contaminants, it's also listed as pesticide. And we have value maybe, kind of different from the OEHA. And for the EPA, they also OPP, Office of Pesticide Program, they're actually also different from IRS. So even within the, EPA, if the same, different agency, they handle completely different. So that's why I say, eventually if, I'm not sure if, when you give us the TRV, you just give the value and the study you choose, or you give us all the TRVs you can find, and then let the committee help you decide which one to use. Because to me, I think that would be better, because then we can look at all these, selection criteria, and then make our suggestion.
Yeah, thank you, Daisy. I'm imagining almost a chart of kind of all TRVs and the different kind of dates of publication or timeline of the study, the methodology, et cetera, and really using that to inform the group. Let's go, John Vandenberg. Can I mute John?
Sorry, there you go. I agree with many of the recent comments, and that is that most recently published is not necessarily the one that should be selected by out of hand. I think it does take some evaluation of what the differences are across the different ones. David Farrar made a good point that the methodologies for some areas have changed towards, for example, benchmark dose. I think that's really important, but the point that John Boudreau made about ethylene oxide is exactly on point, is that you've got different organizations that are authoritative and yet they have very different values. And so there's no automatic take the most recent. I think that would be a mistake. I think it does require an evaluation if there are different values for different authoritative sources. So I think that's along the lines of what I would say. And I guess, yeah, that's enough for now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, John. Any other thoughts or questions? Because I think this is bleeding into the next part of this conversation around how you kind of hold and weigh or the kind of preference. Matt?
maybe not, it's not a reflection. I think I want to say back what I'm hearing while we're all in the same room. And I think a little bit what I'm hearing from the group is, you know, maybe the approach of using the most recently published TRV is a good screening step or a first step in a stepwise process that would help us identify chemicals that need a deeper investigation into differences in methodology. Or is that a fair reflection of the conversation, that it's an important step, but you all are cautioning against us using it as the sole decision-making framework?
I think certainly, let's put it back to the group. I think certainly y'all have heard that that should not be the default answer. But to Matt's reflection, is there any points of clarity or additions that you would add to that kind of high-level summary? John?
I think you said it quite well, actually. It's really screening things and looking as a starting point, but don't just take it automatically. It's almost like you could develop a decision tree as to looking at, if there are multiple sources, what are those multiple sources? Why are they different? Then is a key question that needs to be determined. And which one is, again, the science policy choice, which one follows the guidelines more closely to what the Oregon DEQ would develop, or perhaps which ones are more protective of public health in the absence of really digging into every detail here.
Thanks, John. David?
I'm wondering about people's thoughts about does it make more of a difference? Does the recency of publishing does it take on more importance if there's a greater magnitude time difference between like the new version and the old one? I mean, like I used the example, like there are still, like for example, there are still iris values out there from like the 90s, like early 90s. So I would lean pretty heavy, like I would be pretty surprised if I looked at a value for the same chemical from 2023 and decided that the 1991 value was still the most recent science, or like the best one, I guess, especially if they were from similar agencies. Like ATSAC took a look in 2023 and IRIS looked in 1991. You know what I mean? But maybe if they're closer together, like just a couple of years apart, looking at generally the same period of peer review literature, then that's when you might have to go more into the weeds.
That's an interesting question. So do we trust the 90s? Maybe that's John, please.
You know, I think it's absolutely true that some of the IRIS assessments are rather old. One of the things that we did some years ago, and I don't know that it was ever published, was to look at, if you did them over again, did a renewed assessment, it didn't change the value for most of them very much at all. They were within a factor of 2. And sometimes they were lower value, and sometimes they were higher value. So there was not a generic assumption that a newer assessment is of higher or lower level than previous ones. But I think it is an open question, I think, about how to consider it. You know, the point you made earlier, David, about the benchmark dose modeling, you know, again, it is superior to using a NOEL and a LOEL, but oftentimes it's not that different from a NOEL and LOEL in actual application. It's just you feel more confident that you've modeled the dose response, but sometimes the NOELs were pretty close to what would have been a benchmark dose 5 or 10, for example.
Yeah, thanks, John. Let's go, Daisy.
So I actually have a question. So just to follow John. So if you have a very old TRV, are you going to update it with the new methodology? Because like, you know, I think they mentioned earlier, now, you know, it's like a default to use the BMD modeling instead of a NOEL approach. So are you going to like update all the TRV? It's kind of old.
Are you referring to me? I just want to be sure.
I think it's a question for the agency.
Yeah, for the agency.
Yes. So if you find things that are super old, is that kind of an automatic need to update? Is that kind of the question you're asking, Daisy?
So I'm asking, like, you know, say chemical A, and it's like 1993. And then no
Mhm.
other agency ever, updated the value. And by Oregon suddenly has this chemical. Are you going to update with the newest, methodology, or you just use the 1993?
Yeah, that seems like a good question. I don't know who the responder is, right? Like, so is there a timeline where it almost triggers I don't know, requirement's probably not the right word, but kind of triggers this need to then update those TRVs. And so I don't know if you can pick a date, but if I hear you, Daisy, you're saying, well, if something's from 1993, hasn't been updated, and here we are 30 years later, should that require, or should that be a trigger for an updated TRV? So I don't know from the agency how you all have maybe thought about that piece. So maybe sit on that. John, let's go to you, Boudreaux. And then maybe I'll ask the agency to kind of opine at least on what Daisy just asked. John?
It's been my experience that most of the old health values, if they get updated, there's a new data set out there. I don't think anybody is pretty much updating numbers in response to change methodologies for the most part. So if there's a number that dates back from the 90s or even the late 80s, a lot of times it's just because there's no new data really generated to go ahead and generate a new health value from.
Okay, that's a caveat. John Vandenberg, I saw you pop off mute. Jump in.
Well, I think John's exactly right. Is many of the older ones, iris assessments, for example, there are not any really new studies. And so they have not been a priority to update. They may not be as important as some of the big ticket chemicals like ethylene oxide, like formaldehyde, like arsenic, that tend to be where the resources go, just because that's what the agency regulatory programs are prioritizing.
Yeah, so let's, John Boudreaux, if you want to add, and then Matt, love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, and I think a little bit that is a chicken and the egg issue, because once there's health values out there, then the people that would generate new data, be it, a responsible party or an agency, look at that and say, well, why do we need to look at that again? Because that's going to cost money. Better to do studies on chemicals where there's no tox data. So it kind of self-reinforces itself.
Yeah, thanks, John. So let's go, Matt, and then Daisy, I do want to just make sure that you feel like you've gotten a kind of response to that, or if you have any other thoughts on kind of what you just raised. But Matt, let's start with you and then come back to Daisy.
Yeah, well, first, this is a really great discussion and exactly what we were hoping for today. And don't make, I guess one thing we should have said is if we're not giving you a straight answer, that's not because we don't want to, it's because we haven't made up our mind. And this is an advisory process, so we want, we're going to be thinking about all of this. But I think the question for me that Daisy asked, I want to maybe put back in the frame of the proposed criteria we introduced about when the agency would go deep with this body versus not. And one of those criteria are that none of our authoritative sources have a value. And I think what the question is that the right criteria, or do we want to introduce some kind of temporal cutoff, not just that it has a value, but it has a value post some date. And I think that's the conversation we're having right now. And so that's interesting. And I just want to remind everyone of the kind of frame around, when are we willing to rely on an authoritative source that has a value, understanding the limitations that or differences that may have existed at the time, versus when do we want to move something into the category of really deep review by agency staff in consultation with this group, with an understanding that we're not going to be able to do that for 250 plus chemicals. So this is great. I appreciate the conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. It does seem like, to your point, John, I mean, there would be factors that would have to exist, like data, in order to be able to do that, right? So if you don't have relevant data, you wouldn't be able to move that forward. Daisy, can we come back to you?
Sure. So, the reason, I ask this question because in our, car EPA, we have a program like detect all the fresh produce for pesticide residues. We actually updated the reference concentration or reference dose, for like we set up a date, a date like a couple years old. And then whenever hit, a value was not evaluated in couple, and we just dig into the references to update the most recent, reference dose just to be protected the public. So I think even though the study may be old, but the methodology actually changed a lot. Like, if you use BMD modeling, the value is different from NOAA. And also, for the inhalation, I think the EPA come up with like 2012 guidelines for the port of entry effect. Actually, that one will increase your TRV instead of lower your TRV. If you use, that guidance, they used to just like when you, calculate human equivalent concentration from rat study for the port of entry effect. You just do the, surface area, divided by surface area, but not anymore. The 2012 guidance said that just use one, because there's a huge document, all the science behind it. That's why I say, if anything before 2012, for the port of entry effect, your TRV, if you adopt that guidance, then you're going to change your value after 2012. So that's why I'm asking is because you can be challenged by public. You not use the recent methodology, most sound science. So that's why, when you see all the value, even same study, but all the methodology changed already. And now I think EPA also come up with the MPPD modeling software. So it's, when you have a particles and the depend on different region. So your calculation, you have the ratio called the region, to calculate the human equivalent concentration. This also changed. So the methodology actually advanced a lot already. So even with the old study, your value could be completely changed. But, because, different agency has different priority, they may not necessarily look at the chemical or, organ interested.
Yeah, thanks, Daisy. We'll let the agency deal with the politics of how the public might respond to not using the most recent study, if that's the case. Jessica, to you, please.
I was just going to add on to that. The portal of entry effects and that 2012 guidance is huge. It causes the point of departure to go down to 1/10 of the value using the previous guidelines versus the default factor of 1:1, which is what they recommend now. But interesting, even though that document came from EPA, you see most EPA does not use that. They still refer back to the 1994 guidance. ATSDR does not use the updated recent inhalation guidance. So I think, again, that's going to go back onto what the policy is and what Oregon wants to do and how Oregon wants to develop these values, because that's going to play a big part of which ones actually make sense.
Yeah, that seems like a big conversation. I don't know if, from an agency perspective, do you have thoughts around kind of the 2012 guidance as it's being referenced, and or is that future discussion? John?
Yeah, so I authored a lot of that, and I wouldn't necessarily call it guidance. I know a lot of people have adopted some of it, but in the majority of assessments I have begun to work on, we have been implementing it. It's just that recently we haven't really been necessarily working on strict portal of entry chemicals lately. Plus, we have a lot more PBVK modeling going on. So I think that's really what's been taking over as far as priorities go.
Thank you, John.
But it's a status report that we're sort of using, but it's sort of being adopted, but I would not call it official guidance.
Okay, Daisy?
Just wanted like DPR, we actually adopted this port of entry, the conversion factor for 1. So we actually, our agency, we use it for the 1,3-D and for the sulfur fluoride. Both we use, the newer guidance. So because look at, although you only work on like dozen of chemicals, but at least in the rat study is very well justified by the PBPK modeling or by the CFD modeling. Yeah, just to let you know. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Daisy. John,
Awesome. I appreciate that.
your work is not going unnoticed, right? Holly, please.
Just a quick note that I appreciate the discussion, and if someone could send that to us, we have not been using that guidance or that status report, and so that's really interesting to hear, and I'd like to read it and go through it as we kind of set up this process for selecting TRVs. So just want to say, I'd like to consider it.
Yeah, thank you, Holly. And I guess let's carry that message forward. So I think as all of you, when you reference either reports or guidance or criteria or appendices, whatever it is, resources that could be helpful, I think that will be an expectation. Is of course, you have to be able to find it, but if you have the opportunity to source any of the reflections or offerings in this space, it'll be great to make sure that the agency has it. Jessica?
Sorry, not to beat a dead horse, but TCQ also adopted the new updated inhalation reference, and we also actively went back and retroactively corrected our numbers that were based on the old guidance. So I think it's really important, but not to beat a dead horse.
No, I think the point's made. I mean, I think that, one of the things that, we talked about at the first meeting that seems really important is where you all are aligning on your commentary and on your ideas and concepts. It's really important for the agency to hear. So when hearing some of the same direction coming from ATSAC, that's really important. So I guess I would offer, don't ever be afraid, to use your language, Jessica, to beat the dead horse. To reaffirm or to really make sure that the agency is getting an assessment of kind of where there's areas of agreement. I think that's really important. Daisy, I saw you flash off mute. Did you want to add one more thing?
Yeah, I just want to say I sent Holly, I sent you the guidance, the 2012 guidance.
All right.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Quick work, Daisy. Thank you. Well, let's keep going, Holly. I'll give it to you, and we'll go to the next couple slides and next discussion question.
Okay, great. So we have one more section to talk about acute, and then I think we have a short break after this. So here is that table, just like how we looked at chronic. This is the table that's coming out of that handout for acute TRVs. And as I mentioned earlier, it's important to note here that in our rules, we're talking about 24 hours of exposure for acute TRVs. So in terms of acute TRV application in Oregon, this program and Clean Air Oregon, it's not intended to be a mechanism for any addressing emergency situations where exposures of like less than an hour could affect health. There's other mechanisms to address emergency situations other than how these values will be applied. So in the past, we chose acute TRVs from our authoritative sources with exposure times that best match DEQ and OHA's assumed exposure period of 24 hours. And this table lists that order of preference there. So DEQ, in consultation with you all, can also set an acute TRV. This gives us that flexibility in choosing TRVs that might best match this exposure duration definition. I also want to point out there are some cases where we have existing acute TRVs that are derived from or are equivalent to chronic values. And this has occurred in two different types of situations. So the first is when it's not clear when a developmental health effect is initiated during the developmental period. And then the other situation is when an acute TRV chosen is a lower value than the chronic TRV. So in those cases where the acute TRV was lower, we set it to be equal to the chronic TRV. So we acknowledge that in these cases, deriving acute TRVs from a chronic TRV is not ideal. And where appropriate and possible, we'd prefer to derive an acute TRV from a study with an actual acute exposure duration. So during our review, we're really going to plan to try to find alternative TRVs that are based on studies with these short-term acute exposure periods, but would really like to open it up for feedback. Any feedback you have, we want to listen to and incorporate and think about of how could we best look for acute TRVs from other organizations, and how could we have some sort of an order of preference that would help us kind of pick or kind of select TRVs to bring to you all in further meetings to discuss. So maybe we could go to the discussion question and then open it up.
Yeah, and there's kind of two. Yeah, there's kind of two here, right, Holly, that we're kind of asking simultaneously. One is just kind of the order of preference that you saw on the last slide. And then really to your point, right, this other sources where you see the current acute is actually the same or equal to the chronic non-cancer. So let's start with you, Jefferson, and then we'll same process.
Yeah, thanks. I don't have any major disagreements with the priority that you've listed. Obviously, the use of the OEHA acute 1 hour value is going to present some, fairly massive sorts of extrapolation issues to go to 24 hours for some chemicals. I mean, it may be totally fine for chemicals where it's almost entirely a portal of entry concern, but obviously for chemicals where you're, to extrapolate from 1 hour to 24, it's going to present some issues. But I guess as long as that's caveated adequately, I guess that should be okay. But it's going to be potentially requiring some kind of an uncertainty factor to get to the 24-hour number, because you're going to be trying to get into a lower number, presumably. That's one comment I had. Another is that in terms of additional sources of acute values, it might be useful to look into the acute reference doses that exist by agencies that collect that information or require it from companies that derive or conduct studies to meet regulatory requirements. I know that in the food safety area, there's acute reference doses that are there's lists of them, and they come from WHO and other sorts of sources, European Food Safety Authority, and so forth and so on. So those could be areas where we can consider drawing upon at least the key studies if we're talking about a systemic effect. So just a couple of quick thoughts on my side.
Yeah, thanks, Jefferson. I mean, you referenced WHO. I mean, do you have other sources where that kind of extrapolation that you described has been done well, or is there references that you would suggest?
Well, I mean, for the acute reference doses, it's typically not done for inhalation exposures. So, we would have to just take the systemic effect and reach some kind of a conclusion whether or not it could be easily translated onto an inhalation scenario or not. But, the European Food Safety Authority, they also have, and there's other country authorities like the Australian Chemical Authority. They have lists of acute reference doses that they derive, or else potentially they require companies to provide data, and then they derive it from that. There's just various ways that these agencies end up with these numbers, but at least it does provide you with an acute number. Oftentimes they're based on animal studies that are not necessarily an acute exposure. It may be oftentimes a developmental toxicity study or a reproductive toxicity study. Sometimes a subacute study. It's very rare that you'll get a 1 hour study. But in the typical acute sorts of studies that are used for classification and labeling, those are not going to be sensitive enough to really pick up subtle effects. Those are conducted for different reasons. So, but yeah, I think that there might be some utility in, at least looking at an assembly of the acute reference doses that exist internationally.
Yeah, thank you, Jefferson. Let's go, John Vandenberg.
I think one of the, as I look at the write-up here, I'd like to suggest that there be some clarification that what we're talking about is toxicity reference values for acute exposures. It's not for acute effects, because you can have long-term effects from a short-term exposure, like developmental toxicity was just mentioned. And so I think there could be some clarification for the reader. We kind of know what it is, but there may be others that would read this that might be confused. That you need to be very clear. We're talking about chronic exposures. We just finished the discussion about, because chronic exposure is meaning for a lifetime or for some extended period of time. Here we're talking about acute exposures and the effects of that, which could be short-term, so-called acute, or intermediate or long-term. So I just struggle with this a little bit because it's almost like we're using a shorthand that may be confusing to people. Just to be really clear about that. And going back for a moment, I find that the table that was put together, I guess this table 1 in the fact sheet, by layering the chronic TLVs, non-cancer and cancer together, I find that to be actually not very helpful. I would, my own personal preference would be to have it be cancer and then non-cancer effects, because by intermingling them, you're kind of mixing things up a little bit, again, for the less experienced reader. So I would just suggest that that be its own table. Table 1 be broken into 2 tables, and this be a different table. Regarding the questions, that's really it. Just be really clear what we're talking about is acute exposures or chronic exposures and either cancer or non-cancer effects. And there are studies that have been done of just a couple of hours exposures, particularly for developmental and neurological effects, that can be long lasting. So they can be acute responses, or like developmental toxicity can be lifelong effects. So exposures and effects, we just need to be really clear about that. I don't have anything else to say except to try to be as clear as possible. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that, John. I know Australia was brought up by Jefferson. I know Australia and New Zealand are different places, but they're at least closer in proximity. So let's go to John Stanek. You there, John?
I don't have any other sources I can think. The majority of sources I can think of were like the old Eagle program out of EPA, and some others were, but those were always acute values for inhalation associated with advisory levels and like effects were going to happen, like emergency type situations. The majority of our efforts haven't just quite happened at the agency to try and develop acute values. That's about all. Everything I can think of is associated with emergency type situations.
Yeah, thank you, Jefferson, and then we'll go Don Boudreau.
Yeah, thanks. So just a quick along those lines with the Eagle values, I completely agree. They're developed for, they don't really have margins of safety built in same way that a lot of other values do. But one of the things that they do have is, and oftentimes a fairly rigorous assessment of the time duration adjustment. So the Haber's law sorts of considerations, and that actually could be interesting or potentially useful. If we're getting to a point where we're trying to assess, to what degree a study of a different duration will fit, the TRV need. So it might be useful to at least consider some of those documents, even if the numbers themselves aren't necessarily, perfect fits.
Yeah, thanks, Jefferson. Let's go John Boudreau, and then Daisy, and then Jessica.
Yeah, well, just to say with the Eagles, Jefferson, I think you were maybe in on some of the discussions with Southern California and some of the community exposures that they had. And the Eagles are interesting as far as the information they come up with, but the numbers tended to be not all that useful. So as a secondary source, they might be useful, but is a number that you can depend on for this context, not so much. And I know our WIA practice, for example, with extrapolating from route southern inhalation is certainly for the acute health values is kind of like something that we would, if we did it, we would do it with great trepidation, and we didn't do it. So.
Yeah, thanks, John. Let's go Daisy and then Jessica.
So this actually is a very good question, because in our agency, for the reference dose, we actually had the same, problem. So our strategy, because our agency are equipped with all the risk assessor, so for a comprehensive risk assessment, actually we will look into all the studies and if try to find out some effect associated with short-term or very acute, like 1 day, a week, something like that. But I don't think DQ has the resource to look into all the studies to find out that those, even from a chronic study, actually sometimes we can find some endpoint that represented, the acute exposure effect. But so, for you, I think maybe the best bet is if there's no acute TRVs, and look into the developmental study. Because we actually we assumed a developmental window exposure, the effect could result from a 1 day exposure, even though your exposure is the whole developmental. But you can, it's a reasonable assumption. You can assume the effect could be derived from 1 single day. So I think that the best bet maybe go look into the ATSDR. They have a toxicological profile. Look into their developmental study, see if there's an effect. You can use that effect to derive acute TRVs. But then if none of and another alternative is like any short-term study, see if you can see some effect. It's like within a week of exposure. That's also a reasonable assumption, a credit to the acute exposure. And then last, we just use chronic. So we have a tiered process. So first we look into, for our, we need to make a quick decision. We just look into the developmental study, short-term study, then nothing, and we chronic it. And for our full risk assessment, we just look at every study and find any kind of, effect associated with acute exposure. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Daisy. Jessica, and then I actually want to make sure that maybe David, you and Holly have kind of gotten all the responses. But Jessica, please.
So again, I would just say Texas has acute values. They develop acute values for all of the chemicals that are monitored in the state of Texas, whether those have gone through a full review or have used surrogation or read across to develop that. Those are available. Also, I would be hesitant about using ATSDR intermediate values to drive an acute value, considering that some of those studies could be up to a year and you're trying to develop a value for a single day. And I'm not sure that that kind of duration adjustment would be practical.
Yeah, thank you, Jessica. So maybe David and Holly, are there further questions? I don't know if you got a lot of response to the first bullet, right, on kind of the order of preference. But David, Holly, is there any other kind of questions, reflections, clarification on y'all's end?
I can't think of any right now. This has all been really, really helpful. So we've captured everything.
Yeah.
We if we have follow-up questions in the future, maybe we can email me. Holly, have you thought of anything?
No, my wheels are turning. This is good. I'm just trying to absorb as much as I can right now. And one other thing I was just thinking of, I haven't looked into this very far, but I did see that it was somewhere at EPA. I think it was a Superfund Health Risk Technical Support Center. I saw that they had like an acute naphthalene value. Is that a source within EPA that we should be looking at, or have any of you heard of that source at all? I just saw the naphthalene document, so I just wasn't sure. Does that ring any bells?
John?
I thought the Superfund values actually came from the Office of Research and Development, the PPRTV program. John Stanek, do you know what Holly's referring to?
You have to do some cross-referencing, it sounds like. Holly, John?
No, I do not. Because I know naphthalene's in process, so I'm not quite sure.
Yeah.
I'll put it in the chat. I was just curious because it didn't say PPRTV, so then I was wondering if I'm missing other sources, but I was just curious if you all knew.
So that's an NCEA site. That's an older record then. NCEA was the predecessor organization that John Stanek and I were both in. So it's at least, I guess at least some years old, I think. I don't recognize that. I'll take a look at it though.
Okay, yeah, thank you. It was interesting because it said final report 2022. So I was curious, but that was a side question I had.
Huh. I don't know.
I was waiting for you to date yourself there, John.
Yes, yeah.
2 years ago. Well, some homework assignment for you all. Any last thoughts on these discussion questions before we take a short break? Okay, well, I have 2:42 on my clock. Can we take 10 minutes and then we'll come back and continue the conversation? So we come back at about 2:43. Let's come back at 2:53, 10 minutes from now. Does that work? Okay. We'll see you in 10
Thank
minutes.
you.
Thank you all. All right, hopefully, 2:53, hopefully folks, got a well-deserved rest. I'll interpret, cameras on, hands up, or some mechanism, comments in the chat saying you're here. As a way to know that we have critical mass returning for the rest of our conversation. Thank you. John, I saw you come off mute. I'm going to interpret that as you are actively listening. Daisy, same thing. Okay, I think we have, if not all of us, most of us back. So if, Holly, I'll pass it back to you if you want to go to the next slide.
Sure, sounds good.
Oh, John, before Holly, before you go, John.
Thanks. I just might point out, I did look at that acute reference concentration for naphthalene, and it was done in 2022. If you look at page 2 of it, there's a pretty lengthy disclaimer there that was done as part of a response to a very specific request. And there's some characterization there that is worth looking at, just on page 2.
Okay.
Thank you.
Awesome. I will read that. Thank you.
Student of the year right there, John. That was quick.
Those computers, man, with a computer, you can find stuff fast.
I love it. Well, thanks for that guidance and direction. All right, Holly, go for it.
Sounds good. So I have a few more slides and then we'll open it up to the last of the discussion questions. But here I wanted to cover, this is a slide you saw earlier when Matt was talking, but after considering all the feedback that we heard from you today, we'll kind of begin this next steps of the TRV review process that are outlined on this slide. So to begin, we have those 2 sets of TRVs to review that we kind of talked about earlier. The first is this list of existing TRVs. These are the TRVs that we have in rule, and we want to check to see if there are any updates and make sure that all that information is accurate. Then we're going to check any updates that were made to that list of priority toxic air contaminants in Oregon to see if there are new TRVs that we should add as well. So adding new ones and then updating what we already have. So for those sets of TRVs, agency staff will go through and check TRV information from all authoritative sources. And then we'll also gather information on other TRVs that can be adopted from other organizations or developed. And gathering information from other organizations will be dependent on those factors that we discussed today that we need to go think about, and also staff bandwidth as well. So then after that, agency staff will select initial TRVs using the processes that we've been discussing today. And then we'll set up a series of short and series of meetings with ATSAC. We don't know how many yet. We kind of want to do this initial review first. And we can share a variety of information that we learned during our review and ask for feedback from you all during that time. So there's a couple different things that we can be asking for feedback on. So one, we'll just share the results of what we did, what that process was like and how it worked. And then ask a lot of technical questions that arose during our review process. So we expect to also discuss other tangential work as well and other decisions. One example of that work was provided in another handout to you all, which was that hazard index designation. This was a handout. It was really just for your awareness of potential upcoming work that might come into play. We're not expecting to talk through all of that today, but we might be consulting all of you in the future about whether a toxic air contaminant meets the criteria and rules for changing hazard index designations. In addition, in follow-up ATSAC meetings, we're going to be seeking input from you all if we propose to deviate from our processes or algorithms that we talked about today, or if we propose to use a TRV that's not from one of those 3 main authoritative sources that we have in rule. And as we mentioned earlier, we anticipate right now at least 2. There will be others that we kind of add to this list that we want to talk to you all about. In particular, we want to talk about manganese, the acute TRV with you all, and then desalt particulate matter, that chronic cancer TRV. So we will definitely keep you all posted when we update that list and expand it. And of course, if any of you have any questions on that, let us know before we get there. I think on the next slide, I'll give a little bit more information. So this is all on the tool. So to get started on this, to organize this review of existing TRVs and to add new TRVs to our list, we've developed and spent quite a bit of time on developing this TRV update tool that we can use. And Kristen, who introduced herself earlier, has done a lot of work to put this together. And we've been trying to develop it and create it over the past couple months. So this tool, it's an organized Excel spreadsheet for aggregating and reviewing authoritative source information. I was not able to find a way to put this tool on a PowerPoint slide, so you're gonna have to live with these 2 screenshots of the tool that I put up there for now. And we're not asking for feedback on the tool layout or setup, but I wanted you all to be aware of what we're developing behind the scenes here and to let you know kind of what information it will hold. So briefly, kind of how we plan to use this tool. So it's set up so that we can work on one chemical at a time. And this we thought would reduce the chances of entering data for the wrong chemical, minimize that entry error. And we'll enter in information from each authoritative source for each contaminant that has at least 1 TRV. And this tool is more than a data entry form. It's also built to aggregate information and allow side-by-side comparison so that we can visually confirm changes. And then again, have those built-in checks to minimize entry errors wherever possible. We also want to use it to track decision making. So let's say we propose to deviate from our normal algorithm or process, that rationale can be recorded within this tool. And then further behind the scenes, the tool creates comprehensive key tables on other tabs of all the information that's being entered. And these key tables could be queried in a number of ways. And those proposed changes that we're making, they're all trackable in downloadable reports and directly linked to the appropriate reference information. And a big thing when we were building this was to think about future iterations of this review in mind. This is really the first one that we're getting started on since Clean Air Oregon program was developed. But we want this to be easier and simpler in the future. So we're trying to build this, hopefully with the end goal of turning this into a database in the next round of review. So that's why all this kind of time investment has gone into this thus far. But really, we want to streamline the review as much as possible, minimize input error, and track changes across these different TRV update cycles. But I want to point out here that while we're trying to be more organized and streamlined, we do think that reviewing the TRVs from these authoritative sources will be a large time-consuming effort for our team. We're expecting that for just data entry, decision-making in the tool, and quality control processes will take us hundreds of hours for our staff. And we expect it will take this long for several reasons. So the work that we need to do in here is we need to look for new TRVs that are not currently enrolled. We need to check for new data and sources of information for those TRVs we already have. We also want to closely check units, dates, and other information of each TRV as we transition from kind of this older spreadsheet to this new kind of refined TRV tool. And we also need to track target organ information, which is not present in a lot of lists that we get from authoritative sources. We also need to track additional information for hazard index designations in that separate kind of rulemaking that you got a handout on. So that was a lot of information, but hopefully it was helpful context and all the work that's kind of going on behind the scenes and when we're kind of how we're going to track decision making and criteria that we decide on after our discussion today. So on the next slide, I have the final 2 discussion questions that were on that handout. And I also want to open it up too of like now that we've had some time and we've discussed all these other questions, feel free to bring up any answers to previous questions as well. So I'll pause here and open it back up.
Well, let's dive in. So you see the 2 questions. So certainly a kind of a high level process description and introduction to the tool. Let's open it up random style. I know I've been going in an order, so I'll go by order of hands. If folks have thoughts, questions, comments on the process or input for DEQ and OHA. John.
I really don't have, I'm pleased to see what you're doing. It looks like a lot of work. Is this going to be in some fashion publicly available as well, or the results of it?
Holly, is that you?
Yeah, I can start off, and then I don't know if Kristen, if you have any thoughts on this as well, but what we're kind of trying to figure out is what version of it maybe to make public. I mean, it's a public record, this whole entire tool, but there's a lot of pieces where there's many macros and interconnected cells. And so I think we were thinking about maybe making some of these like summary tables accessible on the web and available, but we haven't really gotten through, thought through the kind of the end deliverable from this.
No,
A database is kind of our end goal.
Yeah, it would be valuable for other organizations, considering the work that you're putting into it to benefit from your work. So I really don't, I just think you're doing a great thing here. So I'm pleased. I don't have any other comments.
And John, I mean, hearing the piece on the summary versus kind of the tool itself, did you have thoughts on that?
It's a technical question as to how that would work if you let people have access to the tool itself. And, there are considerations there that I'm not really competent to talk about, but the more you can provide people the information that comes out of it in a fashion that they can manage it themselves, if it could, for example, export it into an Excel file or some sort of format that people could search and sort as they wish, that could be very informative and less burdensome than having to actually have the tool be publicly available. So that would just be one thought, as an export feature of some kind.
Yeah, so it seems like there's kind of the spirit of kind of making it available and accessible to the public, other agencies, utilizers, and then there's the kind of functionality piece around how folks will be able to access and utilize it. Kristen, did you want to add?
Yeah, I was just going to add that we've been thinking about that a lot. And so the structure of the tool itself is that it's capturing all this data kind of background tables that can then be summarized in any way that we want to moving forward. And so we've kind of been brainstorming a lot of different ways to make these tables, such as one table that just compares the old values to the new values and different kind of TRV decision making. So I think all of that is on the table and can certainly be done.
Yeah, John.
But that's great. I think it was John Boudreau and I were on the former committee, the HITAC committee, and again, I really liked having some tables there in Excel that I could do things with. It was really very, very helpful. So I wouldn't necessarily think you have to overdo it, but I think if you can create an export function that's just for users, that's really helpful. So thanks.
Yeah, thank you, John. John Boudreau?
Yeah, we had got ever so many requests for, well, can you provide this information and can you sort it in this particular way or do this for us? So yeah, you want to be able to export this as something that people can play with it to their heart's content.
Yeah, thanks, John. Daisy, I'm wondering if I can call on you. I mean, I feel like you were referencing something similar to this type of model where you can kind of look at look at this type of data. Do you want to chime in?
I'm not really clear. What do you mean?
I thought you had talked about just kind of the idea of being able to kind of see the reference values and sources and things like that. Yeah. I just want
what I'm trying to say, like eventually, because if there's only one TRV, I don't think there's a problem if your guidance just say whatever available from the agency you have. But the problem will arise if there's like 3-4 values from different agency, then come down, because now I look at the table you have a ATSDR, EPA, CAR EPA, and then this committee. So do you actually, refer to this order? Like you can't stick to the ATSDR's criteria first, and if non-value available, then you go to the, so it's kind of, you don't have your own, set up, because it's eventually come down if the same study, most, difference will come down, like, do you use modeling? Do you use, different uncertainty fact? Do you use the most, recent methodology? So it will come down, similar things. then it's a matter, like I already said, each agency has their own justification to choose a particular method. So eventually it come down to you, like, do you need I know it's kind of science policy, but it's also science. It's also, related to the health risk assessment. It's not completely, it's a policy-wise per se. There's a lot of science behind each of these criteria. So maybe, this committee has kind of help you to, put up some kind of general guidance. Then in the future, you kind of said, okay, we want to go 1, 2, 3. So I think eventually, if there's more than one value, we will come down. How do you choose? It's so many arguments. We argue within EPA all the time. So yeah.
Yeah, and I guess, I don't know, for Holly or Kristen, and I haven't spent, of course, a lot of time with this. I mean, how does this tool intersect with what Daisy was just describing, right? If you have multiple PRVs for the same chemical, how would that show up here? Or is this only once you've made the decision and gone through kind of the order of operations or preference? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I can start. So on one page we have one page, kind of a tab you can go into for each chemical, and there are sections for each of the authoritative sources where we track all the information that's going in kind of an ordered way. And then there's another section for DEQ. And so this is the part where we have flexibility and we can bring in and say, okay, Texas has this value, here's the information about it. And we can, add more criteria to add in. We've structured those boxes how we want them. And then there's a table at the end that kind of summarizes all of it. So it says, okay, so for acute TRVs, you have this one and this one. And so we can kind of visually compare it there and then make a selection. But that's something like how the tool is built, but there's also the decision of how much information we want to put in the tool and how much time are we going to spend on each individual source where a value comes. So and that's kind of the piece we're trying to figure out right now. And that's why this discussion is really helpful of how much do we want to put into this tool and how much time do we take looking at each value in here.
Yeah, thanks.
Does that help at all?
Kristen, I saw you came up or on camera.
I think Holly explained that just right, just that we do have set up a kind of a prep table that summarizes all the information you put above. And it, based on the logic that Holly's been describing today, which, after getting your feedback, it shows you which one it recommends based on that logic. And then you can choose to use it or not, but it doesn't automatically default to that. So we've kind of set up, as I think, Ben, you had described earlier, that kind of table that summarizes all the values together. And so we have built that in.
Yeah, thank you, Kristen. Daisy?
Yeah, so I looked at your Excel table. So do you actually, attach the critical study, like all the justification in your table expanded somewhere, or you just put a value there? Because if you just a value there, for us, of course, it's not much useful, but, for your agency, yes, yeah,
So that would be
right.
a proposed addition, is actually having kind of the reference, if I'm hearing Holly?
Yeah, so Daisy, right now what we have is we have the place for the value and the date the value was created and who it was created by. And then there is a separate place with target organ information for each chemical where we go in and we list what the critical effect is, if we have different notes, a link to the documentation we're looking at. We track uncertainty factors in there right now. I think we have like a total uncertainty factor as well. But it does include target organ information as well as any information on developmental or reproductive hazards. That gets at that hazard index designation piece of work as well. So we are tracking some additional information in there right now, and we have flexibility to change it at this step as well to add more.
All right, thank you, Holly. And certainly, I think, if folks are interested in doing a deeper dive in the nuts and bolts of this, that can be made available. I think at a high level, it's the question is really around kind of the process for reviewing and utilizing this as a mechanism to do so. Do folks have questions or comments or thoughts on kind of the proposed methodology? All good? Okay, is there other questions, I mean, for OHA and PQ? Are there things that you haven't heard that you would want to ask questions about, or things that haven't come up that maybe you were hoping would today? I mean, it sounds like that we've really kind of dove pretty deeply into a number of the questions that have been provided for discussion, but I want to make sure we don't kind of walk out today with any pieces that felt important for you all to hear, or questions that maybe have emerged as we've had these conversations. People are like, it's 3:15 on a Friday, or 6:15 or whatever time it is for many of you. David?
Yeah, I was just gonna ask, we think that we found, I think that we might have found this already, but if anyone knows of like locations of like the comprehensive list of all the reference values that like your organization, that like OEHA has, or that IRIS has, I think we found them already. But if there's one that you think is really useful that includes like a lot of data, like target organs or critical effect or uncertainty factors, like all in one list in one place, it'd be good if you could share that with us. I think I'm pretty confident we have that already for IRIS and PPR TVs, and I'm pretty sure we have it for ATSDR also. I'm not sure if we have that for OEHA, but those will be really helpful in like sort of preloading the tool for us, or those kind of lists are really helpful for Kristen to like, so that the tool is kind of preloaded with some of the stuff that we want to consider and look at. So if you're aware of like sort of comprehensive lists for different organizations like that, I think we found one for TCEQ also. Like there's at least there's a website. I haven't checked if that's like downloadable as like an Excel sheet or not. Like to be able to see like here's all the chemicals that have a value.
Yeah, thanks, David. I know John Stanek, you had referenced an appendix from some previous work that may be a resource if you can find it. John Boudreau?
Yeah, I'll check through my grab bag, see what I migrated over from my OEA computer and can share.
I love it. John Vandenberg.
For some systems like IRIS, there's the public facing part of that you have access to like everyone does. But you may contact the IRIS staff and they may be able to have the programmers behind the scenes do an export for you that might help facilitate uploading some of the data into your system there. The same for the PPR TVs. There's programmers behind the scenes there that might be able to help, that would not be the public so much, but might be able to facilitate access to that information, save you some time.
That's a great idea. Put some other people to work, right? To help out. Other thoughts? Yeah.
I do have that question for Jessica also for TCEQ, because we have found useful values there, and I know that online you can find like a web page with like the list, but do you know if there's like a downloadable Excel something that would be amenable to kind of easy transfer into our, something that's cross-referenced with like CAS number or something, so that
something injected
so that could so that we could like preload that into the tool somehow also.
Well, first I'd like to say I love the shock that you actually found a decent value with Texas. That was pretty good. But yeah, so we actually moved to a database system because we had so many values and so much data to input. But when you go into that system, you're able to create Excel files from there, or text lists that you can import into Excel. So, and you can do it specifically for what you're looking for. So if you only want acute values or you only want chronic values, you can kind of specify what you're looking for that.
Also, I didn't mean for that to sound surprising. Like Texas does a good job. I didn't mean that to be like, I wasn't like surprised that there was a good number.
Thanks for that clarification, David. Other thoughts on these questions? Okay, well, let's move. It won't be the last time you'll be able to give feedback, and certainly, you know, things pop up between meetings. But we want to just create some space, and you know, we're ahead of time, which I guess I shouldn't jinx it, but we're ahead of time, as every facilitator loves to be able to say. But we wanted to just create some space. You know, we've had now a couple hours of conversation. We've covered some ground, and just want to open it up to any final questions that folks might have, or further input that you'd like to offer as you kind of listened to each other and kind of, you know, absorbed all the materials and navigated this conversation. So just kind of, maybe I'll just open to go around the room one last time and just see if there's any final, whether it's questions or just comments or input that folks might have. I'll go in the order of whatever list I made here. So Jessica, I have you going first. Any final thoughts, questions, input, comments?
You said Jessica, right?
I did say Jessica. Yes, please.
Sorry, cut out on my end. No, I think this is great. I'm impressed that you guys are willing to take the step to make your own values, or at least adopt values and go through this process. So I hope it works out well.
Good, thank you. And then I have John Vandenberg.
I think y'all are doing a great job. The air toxics world is a difficult one. You're faced with oftentimes very limited information, and because doing inhalation studies is very difficult to do, and these chemicals oftentimes have not been studied very much, and so you're stuck with a smaller universe than you might like. So one of the questions I guess I might, or a point I might make, is that there are a lot of chemicals that are the dirty 20 or whatever that you always know are going to be of concern to the public. It's the metals, it's the chromium, it's the formaldehyde, it's the arsenic, you know, that are everywhere, pretty much people are exposed to. But I don't know if you have, in identifying the list of chemicals that you're focusing on, if you've gone into all the sources of potential exposure information, which would include, for example, the toxic waste inventory. That's an obvious one. But there might be other sources as well in terms of pesticides registration, where the pesticide itself is being carried by another chemical, and that might be appropriate as well to consider. So I just would, you know, we don't want to look on the lamppost too much. And this is kind of a reflection of what I'm seeing here in the state of North Carolina, is this emerging significant concern about the PFAS and PFOA mix of chemicals. There's a much bigger group than I think we recognize. And the state here has been doing a lot of monitoring and focusing on what is the level of exposure. And it's a significant concern. So we don't want to look under the lamppost, I guess is what I'm saying. And I don't know, as you're thinking about the list of chemicals, Lord knows you don't need to add more work, but I just want to make sure that you've got your eyes open to other potential emerging contaminants that have not been recognized as being a big problem in the past. So anyways, I think you're all doing a great job, and I applaud you very much for the work you're doing.
Yeah, thank you for that, John. I know that's part of our closing to talk about next steps, but I know DQ, OHA, do you want to talk about kind of the approach of bringing the list of chemicals and how you're thinking about the next conversation, just that John brought it up? Is that you, Matt? Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I'll start and then invite Holly, anyone else to weigh in. I think I suppose our very first step is just going to be debrief what we learned today. We want to continue a practice of giving you all another week or two. If you have additional thoughts, please send those our way. You can shoot us an email, or if you want to have a quick conversation, that is just fine too. And I know sometimes you might reflect on today and have something more to share. So please do that, and then we will digest and debrief all of that. And our first decision will be to kind of lock in place the logic, I guess, if you will, that we're going to embed in the tool. And I think our plan is to communicate that to you and our reasoning behind it, so you're not seeing that for the first time in a couple months when you're also getting a big download of the results of that effort. And that really is probably the next touch point for the committee as a whole is we're going to come back to you with the results of that initial screen and share with you, I think, the results, meaning where was there just one value, where do we not want to change things, and where are things more complicated that we want to probably dig in with you all. And hopefully by then we also have, I think that will give us maybe a better sense of the overall workload for this review cycle and how many chemicals we're talking about doing a deeper dive, and we could share with you at that time our thoughts of how we're going to schedule that, that work out. So hopefully that's helpful. Holly, anything you would add there?
No, that sounds great. Yeah, it's hard for me to understand right now, like how many meetings we're going to expect to have in that series, because we kind of want to go do the work and get a sense of that. But I think that's exactly right. We'll debrief and figure out what our next steps are and let you know.
Yeah, David, you had added some in the chat. You want to chime in?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think probably the most immediate touch point you'll hear from us is a chance to review the meeting minutes. Like I think, I don't know if anyone said this earlier, but like the main deliverable from ATSAC meetings are the meeting minutes. And so we're taking notes, and before they're finalized, we'll send them around to all the committee members to make sure that what was said was accurately captured. So that'll be probably even before we're ready to like report out like what we decided to do with the information, just to make sure that that's, because that becomes the actual public record and is the product of the meeting, those minutes.
And then David, just, to give life to what you put in the chat, if there are candidate chemical, to your example, John, and the work that's happening in North Carolina, if there's things that you want the DEQ and OHA to consider, please share those with the team. Let's keep going around. John Boudreau.
I think the approach so far looks great. And one thing that I'm thinking about is that there are other sections other than the one I used to be in WIA that are working on the same kind of problem with, pulling in values from other state programs, state or federal. And like there's a program, for example, SNAPS, that looks at emissions from oil and gas production facilities, where they're looking at an analyte list that is greater than what Cal EPA has health values for at this point. So I will there again figure out who to suggest to get in touch with there, because some of the problems that you're going to be encountering, are going to be similar to what they're encountering, and there might be a little bit of commonality there. So information swap might be very possible.
Yeah, thank you, John. Super helpful for that offering. John Stanek.
Just to echo what others are saying, the approach looks good. I mean, it's something like I pointed out earlier, we struggled with the same thing and trying to figure out how to search places and figure out where to find different values, and even, to the point of physical and chemical properties. You'd asked about additional resources. I'm not sure, like in the appendice link I sent along, we reference I think maybe an EPA actor database and a ToxRef database, but I guess since they've moved, so that link is probably not going to work, and I can't seem on a quick search to find it myself. So that's one thing I'll try to figure out where that went and send along, because that was a place our Comp Tox division had pulled a lot of information. And we were looking at it as well when we were working on hydraulic fracturing. And I think it was a place where they pulled in different references and created a database and reference values. But not having looked at it in a while, I'm not quite sure. And like I said, I'm having a hard time finding where that went. So I'll try to see if I can track that down.
Yeah, thank you, John. Daisy?
Yeah, I echo with others. I think the Oregon's approach is great. You know, you don't really need to, so many agencies do their risk assessment all by themselves. California already did what EPA did the most time. So I think by just searching different sources and make some, good, like a decision, that's more than sufficient already. Yeah. So thank you. I also learned a lot from our discussion.
Thank you, Daisy. Jefferson?
Yeah, thanks. I another echo. I don't have that much more to add beyond what's been said, but I will go and rattle through my files and see what I can send to David. In case that's of any use. I'm looking forward to ongoing discussions.
Yeah, thanks, Jefferson. It's a good segue. I mean, I think all of you can imagine and understand the lift that agency staff will be doing between this meeting and the next. Certainly, I think folks have already made some identification of things that could be helpful for the process. Would ask that we're inviting folks, kind of formally to submit things for the next couple of weeks. So if you come up with things in the next 2 weeks, or if there's any further input, guidance, reflection, comments, concerns, questions, whatever, that can be informative. As Matt was laying out, the team will really be working over the next couple of months to kind of, take what has been absorbed in this conversation and really start setting the baseline for the next set of conversations. So that's kind of the next pieces. Certainly we will make sure to David's point that we're kind of collectively capturing and reflecting back to you all, summarizing what we heard today. So we will want your eyes on that to make sure we get it right. I think David said it really poignantly, like that is the kind of public record for this process, but also one that we want to get right and make sure that we captured what's ultimately some really complicated and technical discussion. So your feedback and time and energy to contribute to that would be super helpful. I don't know, Matt, do you want to offer any other thoughts before we kind of close it out for the day?
Yep. Mostly just thoughts of gratitude. I really appreciate the team at the two agencies for their many hours of work preparing for today and thinking through how we're going to tackle this review cycle. Really appreciate the time of you ATSAC members, especially those who were already into the late hours. I know, late Friday is not ideal. And appreciate you, Ben and Angela, your facilitation services today was really, I think this has been super helpful. It's exactly the type of conversation we were really hoping to have with you all. And I think we're all feeling anxious to get going and for our future engagements with you all. So thanks.
Appreciate that, Matt. Well, we don't have a formal process for adjourning, but I think we've run our course of business for today. It's really exciting for me. It's like a graduate class, being able to listen to the brilliance around this room. So it's been a joy for me. As Matt said, y'all are getting into the wee hours of a Friday afternoon and early evening. So with that, I'll close this out. Much appreciation, and we'll be in touch soon. All right. Take care, everybody.